Good morning. Well, it's not morning everywhere, so good morning and or afternoon wherever you are. And welcome to our weekly webinar. My name is Brad Feeks. I am with the Estes Group. I am here today with my cohort, Chris Koppler. Say hello to everyone, Chris.
Hello, everyone. I'm just working through getting my video working, but I am here and happy to be here.
There you go. Who to go for technical solutions other than a group of guys who can't figure out their webinar? This is a great start to a wonderful Friday, and I hope you guys are having a good Friday and a good weekend to follow. I wanted to do a session today with the ERP community on the subject of hybrid clouds. It's one of those terms that's really one of those, I don't know if you want to call it a buzzword, but it's one of those terms that is very ill-defined and floats in a lot of places. So I'm hoping that out of this conversation, we can help clarify that conversation a little bit. Couple of quick things right away. If you guys have questions, please feel free to use the question and answer feature of Zoom or the chat, and don't hesitate to reach out to us. So we're going to have a lot of fun today, hopefully, and talk through some interesting subjects that I find really intriguing. And we'll take it away from there. Big quick little plug for ourselves. So EstesGroup, we are a private cloud hosting provider for ERP systems. We do infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, various forms of cloud deployment to allow customers to, as the tagline goes, maximize the functionality of the application and maximize their control of the application as needed. That's kind of the big thing about private cloud. It gives you access and control, which is good for a lot of people. And we'll talk about kind of one of the reasons why it is a good thing to have, and we'll use that as kind of fodder for conversation today. All right. This discussion all begins with cloud migration, and that's been something on our minds a lot lately because we've been working a lot to migrate customers to our private cloud hosted environment and finding all kinds of unique quirks to every customer. So you say, oh, every ERP system is an ERP system, and that's true to the most part, except when you start looking at all of what I call the baggage, right? So when you do a normal cloud migration, you have all these normal things you're thinking of. You're thinking of disk and CPU, RAM, all of the things that are, how many resources do I need to have a fully functioning VM environment in the cloud? You start talking about licensure, which can always be a challenge when you're moving from on-prem to cloud, and all the other kind of things that come along with it, with Active Directory and firewall, DRAS, endpoint, all the things that'll help keep this environment safe. But you never really talk about the kind of last thing that gets talked about is what I call the baggage. Now, these aren't baggage in necessarily a bad sense, because these are really important things to a business. The e-procurement or e-commerce site, CRM or SRM, we work with several. We work on that in the P21 space. We work with DC Cap in the Epicor 10. We work with ParkTrap in terms of e-commerce. SRM, we work with SourceDay. They work on both sides of the fence there with their SRM solution. So there's a bunch of different integrations that are used in various applications to try to bolster functionality of a base system. And a lot of systems use what you might call that best of breed approach, where the ERP provides a foundation, but attached to all this are all these different areas that help elevate the functionality of the overall ecosystem. That comes with a lot of baggage when you have to move that system from one area to another. Let's start real quick with a little bit of terminology, because there's a lot of terms thrown around, and it's kind of helpful just to start with some of the basics. We all know that, when applications began being hosted, they were hosted on premise. You'd have the server that's customer managed, locally located. The customer was responsible for pretty much everything. Having that server hardware there, having hopefully a data center that could provide redundant power and cooling to protect that, and basically everything was up to the customer. Software as a service is kind of the flip side of the paradigm, is kind of completely the customer can wash their hands of the back-end implementation of a given application. There, the vendor manages it entirely. The customer just consumes it at like a client level. you're consuming it quite often through a browser, potentially through a fat client if you need a kind of a more robust client experience, but you have no control of that application's backend. I like that the cloud, the rain cloud is kind of a good symbol for SaaS me, because I find private clouds to be kind of leaky, and I find SaaS customers often to be weeping. So it seems like a fitting metaphor anyways. Whereas you look at private cloud, which is kind of what we do, and I like the idea of the little man sleeping in his safe abode in the middle of the cloud there. Here, the idea is it's a little bit of a blend between an on-premise and a SaaS system in terms of it's like a SaaS system. It's purely cloud-based. It's data center provisioned, sitting on top of those on-premise layers and above them. But because it's private, you can carve out specific areas for a given company so that they have this kind of sandbox inside of there where they can live and work and have an environment that has many of the same features of an on-premise environment in terms of access, control, deployment, integrations, etc. So those are kind of your three base layers of this kind of model of computing. But then this takes us to hybrid cloud. So this is one that took a little bit of research over the years, and because I keep, kind of boggling myself in terms of what a private cloud exactly is. So I went to NIST. Why not go ask the government, right? They're never wrong. So NIST defines a hybrid cloud as a cloud infrastructure composition of two or more distinct cloud infrastructures that remain unique entities but are bound together. I like that idea of bound by either some kind of technology, essentially, that is connecting them. So you have an environment that has multiple deployment types that are bound together. So it could be you have a hybrid cloud environment, might include two SaaS environments speaking across each other, two SaaS environments with an on-premise component, on-premise reaching up to a private cloud, speaking to some hybrid clouds. So the lines up there are really important, and that's what transforms a single kind of vanilla cloud environment into a hybrid cloud. And when you think about it, pretty much in this day and age, almost any enterprise cloud environment ends up being a hybrid cloud of one form or another because of these integrations. And so that I use that term bound. That seemed like a good area, and that was my emphasis in there, not NIST's. I think there's actually a Pixie song about that and a little macabre. But anyways, I once had a customer that integrated a CPQ system with an ERP system. We helped them test a series of REST interfaces to allow the two applications to communicate. And then eventually that CPQ system was bought out by the parent ERP system that they were actually integrating. And they went and they took that simple interface we had made and they built out a full integration platform between these two applications to try and approximate the idea of a single application. And that's important because when we talk about what makes a hybrid cloud, there's two terms that you want to throw around here. One's an interface and the other is integration. Now, again, these are terms often loosely defined and used interchangeably. I think there's an important kind of way of differentiating those. And these actually become kind of important as you begin to talk about migrating a cloud environment. And so an interface generally is kind of like a single connection. It's a very simple, quick and dirty connection. It's something that you could have a custom solution provider kind of whip up for you. And then you have one system, you need to get some information over to another. Often they're temporary. They're done in lieu of a more comprehensive integration platform. The benefit, of course, of a simple interface is that they're cheap. Quite often they're like unidirectional. I see a lot of push interfaces in the business that we work in, where one system just does a blind push to another system and says, okay, take this data and do something with it. I'm going to wash my hands after. The two interfaced applications, they're still very separate and very independent. And there's just this very simple kind of like an Indiana Jones rope bridge connecting the two might be one way of thinking about that. Whereas an integration is much more of kind of a comprehensive platform on top of which two applications can rest, or multiple applications for that matter. So it's much more comprehensive. It had more often integration platforms tend to be bidirectional. They're developed by larger teams of developers versus like a single throwaway custom solution. In that way, they're upgradable, maintainable. They're kind of their own application itself. And I've seen companies like, say, in the Profit 21 space, Gray Wolf or DC Cap, they offer individual third-party applications. They also offer platforms that applications can sit on. So I've seen one third-party application use another company's integration platform in order to connect to a given ERP system. So really, I think the way the market is going, those integration platforms become really valuable. And I see those being deployed, at different levels of the architecture. We'll talk a little bit about more of those levels as we come along here. And so with that said, now that we've gotten through our hybrid cloud 101 class, let's talk a little bit about why this is important. Okay, and I like the iceberg metaphor. It always seems like a nice idea of understanding the value of this. Let me give you a little anecdote to start. So customer and a vendor are talking. The vendor is an ERP vendor, just to be clarified. Then the customer is kind of kicking the tires on a SaaS deployment, moving their on-prem solution up their SaaS environment. The vendor's like, well, to migrate to SaaS in 2 months tops. All right, this clearly was a salesman you were talking to. But anyways, the customer, okay, well, but I have a lot of integrations. Are we good here? And then the vendor, nah, it'll be fine. And the customer, well, okay, I had no other choice but to accept that. Now, of course, unfortunately, 7 months later, we have the customer irate, reaching back to that salesperson and saying, dude, this ain't working. Migrating our third-party applications, it's taking 6 months plus, and it's costing a ton of money, a lot more than we budgeted for. And the vendor was, okay, there's really nothing at that point that the customer could do because of unrealistic expectations jumping into it. Now, is it an outright falsehood? Well, when vendors sell, sometimes vendors sell against a happy path. They say, okay, when you move just this application into a SaaS environment, that'll be great. Kind of washing their hands of that hybrid cloud that's lurking under the surface, because in this case with this customer, that's exactly what blew up the budget, blew up the timeline, and caused all these challenges in moving. So it takes a 2-month migration, turns it into a 9-month, is the fact that they had an e-commerce system, some quality management systems, some data management, engineering integrations, all these things lived out there that they were unaware of. And because once they surface them and realize, oh boy, these things don't speak together nicely, because you might have some challenges there, and we'll get into that. We ran into some big problems in making that migration. Now, Chris, what do you hear from the community when you're talking? You see a lot of customers who are struggling with similar migrations. What's the word that you're seeing most often?
Yeah, so with migrations, the big hurdles that I hear from customers is timeline. That it doesn't seem to go according to plan. So it's, hey, we started this implementation, and there's a couple of different reasons. Sometimes it's can't get third-party integrations working. Other times, the main issue that they run into is the customer just doesn't have a dedicated enough time. So the integration, sometimes you just have a very long implementation process. So when you are moving to not from on-prem to a hybrid cloud or to a private cloud, but you're moving into a SaaS, those are just some of the hurdles that you run into. Is really timeline, and dedicating enough resources. The third-party integrations can be very troublesome occasionally, depending on what model that you're working to move into. Private cloud is usually much easier because it mirrors the on-prem footprint the most. So it's more of redirecting where the trains are entering and leaving the train station versus trying to lay new train tracks. So it is a pretty easy change to make when moving to private cloud. The other issue that you run into is egress and ingress fees. How long is it going to take to move that bandwidth, and kind of having that cost can be very cumbersome and a huge hurdle that people are not expecting when they're looking at all the different options when it comes to cloud.
Oh yeah, that's a good point, because ingress and egress fees inside of a cloud model, that's one of those things that if you're working with a data center provider that's charging you for that, you might have your ingress and egress fees based around your ERP system, and it's just base traffic and not necessarily the traffic going out to your third-party integration. So that's
correct.
Yeah, that's a good consideration to make. And I guess for me, the biggest idea here is that your hybrid cloud, that's the thing lurking under the water. That's the portion of the iceberg. They say the Titanic was sunk not by the iceberg that they could see, but whatever was hiding underneath. That's at least what Leo told me. But so the thing, when we think of that database layer, the application layer, the client deployment, that's kind of that above water things that we're noting. But all this other stuff, your integrations, your interfaces, your bolt-ons, your third parties, your homegrown solutions, whatever you want to call all those things, those are the things lurking under that'll blow up your timeline and blow up your budget.
100%.
So Chris, this is another one. Now you've been in a lot of discovery sessions and you've seen those discovery sessions evolve as you have, kind of multiple ones as you get deeper in, and you've seen the customers kind of evolve to understand that they have custom solutions and third-party integrations that they didn't even realize. Tell me a little bit about that if you have any examples or stories of that.
So I think one of the big things is sometimes what people consider a P21 application. I would say that they're not always aware of all of the hooks into P21, and that changes environments, timelines very much so. Doing a P21 from on-prem environment that is a very heavy third-party application such as DocStar can have lots of hooks, lots of timing, lots of costs that go into it. So that is it's gonna basically extend out that implementation process. Sometimes people, I think, don't necessarily think that that is connected with P21. They know that it's leveraged, but we've done discoveries where we went through their kind of P21 application list, and then after the fact, when we started that migration project, they had custom code that they weren't aware of themselves. So it was kind of hard to get in that initial discovery phase. And unfortunately, the people that wrote that code were no longer around to provide any insight. So you can run into those hurdles. And that's really, I would say, the big difference is when you're picking a partner, if you have those internal resources and you're looking at, like, say, a public cloud, you're going to have to figure out those components. That's one of the things that really, I think, separates the Estes support and provisioning and implementation team, is that we do a lot of side-by-side integration and third-party applications and working through those processes, which makes it a much shorter or confined timeline to go live. And makes it so the actual, when you get to the testing right before you flip the switch to make your live production environment, it's usually a much better turnaround and result. So I think that working with a team that understands all of the spaghetti that goes into P21 is going to have a much better result, because you're going to end up with that pasta dish on the actual production side versus kind of just noodles and butter and spaghetti sauce and just the chaos that can ensue.
Hey, I grew up on just noodles and spaghetti sauce back in college. No, but that's a good point, because I think, though, that's what we often find when we work with customers is they don't realize everything they have, right? So you ask yourself that question: how do hidden hybrid clouds happen? Try saying that 20 times without spitting all over yourself. And so when we think about it, things that I think we've seen the end users who don't distinguish between custom and standard. Custom functionality, it quickly bleeds into standard, even in IT departments. Often it's not documented. Developers who actually created custom solutions that are kind of outside of the systems, they might leave or retire, and if it's not documented, now you have these magic ghost apps. New management, I'd say half of our customers have inherited systems that they did not implement and custom solutions in the ecosystems that they did not design or build. Vendor relationships, right? Those atrophy over time if they're not kept up. And vendors are really critical, especially when you're dealing with an actual packaged application that a company has bought and installed, keeping that relationship to make sure that thing's running well. So really that idea, all those things tend you to take down that path that a successful cloud decision, and this has to start with a detailed discovery. And I think that's, to Chris's point, kind of where we have gotten stronger over the years is having to work through so many of these. We take our lessons learned and we learn to ask better questions, and we look to turn over as many rocks as possible to try to find the nasty things kind of crawling underneath. That said, I think it's really important to think about your application and your whole ecosystem as kind of a hub and spoke model. All right. So I like this idea of thinking about an ERP system as kind of the hub of everything, right? Your ERP application is the center of your IT architecture for your enterprise. And the spokes, they're all of these ancillary applications that plug into the ERP system in one way or another. And you want to think about it, the hub moves and the spokes come along for the ride, right? And so the ease of a migration path will definitely depend on what the nature of the hub is. Do you have a hub that's really interactive and really easy to talk to, or do you have a hub that's kind of closed off and very restrictive in terms of the communication paths and such that it will allow for? And that really changes your migration options based on that hub. And I was talking with another consultant once, and the idea of the an application. If you don't like the hub and spoke, I got another metaphor for you. Um, it's the idea of an octopus, and I like to think about an application ecosystem is kind of like a confused octopus. Okay, it's a body with a whole bunch of tentacles, and all those tentacles, they don't get along, right? The tentacles are kind of independent of the head. They lag behind it and they advance at their own pace. So the head's moving at one direction and those tentacles are all kind of dragging behind. Some are keeping up and some are dangling. When the octopus gets somewhere, all those tentacles take a little time to catch up. Some, they stay in place and they refuse to, follow the lead. Maybe they break off over time, right? And that connection gets severed. The idea of each of those tentacles is an application. And that application doesn't necessarily move at the same level of the base ERP. So we have customers who their ERP vendor is offering this new version of an application. It's based on the latest version of Windows and it lives in the cloud and it's purely SaaS based, et cetera, et cetera. But they have old applications that might be legacy. They may have been homegrown. They may have been bought from a vendor who since went out of business, but they're good. They help the organization. They do some good things. But they're connecting at levels that a SaaS system wouldn't support. So that's one of those tentacles that got way left behind. How do you catch that tentacle up? That can be a real challenge for an organization. So understanding when you're migrating your core system, you're dragging all those tentacles along the way. You want to make sure that the head doesn't go somewhere where the tentacles can't follow, because now you have to re-implement each of those tentacles. Or as I say here, if the head's in SaaS and one of the tentacles is still using SQL stored procedures, we're in deep water. And that's because not all clouds are created equal. And when as a customer, I was a customer of an on-premise version of an ERP software and ended up becoming a consultant and then working with on-premise and various versions of cloud and SaaS hosted of that, I discovered very quickly that there was this brick wall hovering in the cloud. And that dealt one with functionality. That's kind of a story for a different time. But there was also this basic idea of access and integration. There was this huge brick wall in the cloud that when you were working with software as a service, you were only allowed that API level integration, right? That topmost level of an application architecture versus, a private cloud where you have basically integration at any level. Now, if you're constructing an application from the ground up for the first time, that's great. Yeah, build it to be web enabled and SaaS compliant and everything. But if you're dealing with legacy applications, you have some real challenges. And goes back to that idea we were talking about with the octopus. If you have an octopus that one of the tentacles is still doing stored procs, you might find it difficult to integrate that with a SaaS environment. In fact, I've seen SaaS customers have to do situations where they replicate their database off to a private cloud just to allow the integrations to work. And now they're having to keep those things in sync. It becomes quite a mess, to be honest, that you have to have a private cloud just to allow your hybrid cloud SaaS-based environment to work. So that for me, the lesson that I learned was that the level of access and control is kind of fundamental to a cloud migration. Now, access, that is from as a customer standpoint, your access to the application's back end so that all of your third-party applications, your hybrid cloud can be deployed and integrated properly and in a way that benefits your business. That's really fundamental as we start to talk about a cloud migration. And the key here then is we talk about the head of the octopus or the hub of the wheel. That's your target, right? That's where you're looking to move. And the question a customer always has, and I'm sure Chris, you see this. Chris, when you're dealing with customers in the cloud space, I'm assuming that quite often they're comparing different targets, right? Do I go back to my on-premise? Do I move to a hybrid or to a private cloud? Do I move it into SaaS? What are these customers encountering as they kind of make those decision-making processes?
Yeah, so if you're doing a migration to SaaS and it doesn't end up working out, a lot of times customers are kind of left short of holding the bag, to speak, because a lot of times if they're doing a SaaS deployment, they might not have the internal expertise resources to deploy new servers or stand up the application from an ERP perspective of configuring all the third-party integrations. So they kind of have to go with another cloud option, and then it's just a matter of how do we do that? How do you manage those expectations? How far along in the implementation process are you? I mean, I've seen SaaS-based implementations where the providers swore up and down that it wouldn't be a problem. $750,000 into that process, they ended up having to go another direction because a key critical third-party integration just wouldn't work because of the SaaS model. And SaaS is not always the same as on-prem. It's very much dependent upon how it's designed on the back end. And in that regard, they didn't have any servers on site. They had to go with the cloud option because they didn't physically even have the hardware or the internal knowledge to kind of deploy that back on-prem. And that seems to be a very common theme that I've seen for SaaS deployments that didn't make it across the finish line. So that is one of the major issues that happens sometimes in SaaS deployments. If you're going to, whether it's private cloud, hybrid cloud, or one of the big public clouds, a lot of times you can just make it work. Your costs might not always be under control. And that's the component that I see of public clouds are great at certain things, but when you're doing an ERP deployment, it's very packaged and it's not necessarily built from we can just provision more resources as we bring in third-party integrations or as we scale. Sometimes you hit those benchmarks where you really have to make quite a financial leap to make it work, but it is doable. And so those are usually the hurdles that I see, whether they're doing a SaaS deployment that doesn't necessarily cross the finish line or they're going to a public cloud. Those are the two primary restrictors. It's either your budget gets blown out of control or you don't have the internal resources, so you have to pick another cloud that wasn't your first option.
Right. And I see that sometimes as a challenge. ERP vendors sometimes are offering very big discounts on software as a service version of their application, right? They're trying to log more customers, get more subscribers. I think probably that challenge has to be that total cost of ownership once you've roped in all of your private cloud changes those numbers significantly. And we, unfortunately find some customers who have already gone through some of that partial implementation. They've taken the kick at the can and, well, the can kicked back. So let's talk a little bit here about your targets as a customer, as you're looking at what is the target environment that I'm trying to go to. So if you're in a on-premise environment, you're trying to go to a private cloud. Largely, as I've said, in many ways, it's an apples to apples in terms of access and control. You'll have some things like changes in IPs, SQL connections, server names. That can affect some of your integrations. Might mean that you're changing a config file. It might mean that you're recompiling a homegrown app or changing the data in a SQL stored proc. And also one of the other things we run into is licensing, because if you're doing something where you have a upgrade bundled into a move, that could have some license implications, both in terms of you might have to relicense the operating system, or the operating system might not be licensed properly to move to the cloud. One of the implications I've normally seen, but from a functionality and an integration standpoint, largely apples to apples. Now, moving from on-premise now to a SaaS, this is probably where customers feel the biggest shift in terms of those major changes to access limitations. You have access level restrictions now that really push everything, as I had said earlier, up to that API level. You might end up having to find that you're constructing workarounds to support that. We've moved several customers from one private cloud to another. It's not uncommon that a customer might be using one MSP and then move to another, or might actually be hosted in a private cloud environment by their vendor and then eventually look to move to another. Again, that's pretty apples to apples. A lot of the same things change here when you're moving from on-premise. The licensing is normally unaffected because you likely already upgraded your licensing. So most often it's just a difference in server names and IP configs. Now, as Chris had mentioned, we have another batch of customers who are coming to us from a SaaS environment. So they had a situation where SaaS was underperforming for them, so they want to come to a private cloud. They still, like Chris had mentioned, they don't have a hardware footprint. I have no hardware to stick this. And so quite often I see this too, where management demands, well, we need to move to the cloud. That's the future. And then the cloud gets conflated with its only option as SaaS. And then the truth is, when you take another kick at the can, swing at the pinata, you realize that, well, private cloud is another option for a company that's hell-bent on cloud. So what we see here with these customers is they tend to be pretty happy because they've increased their access and control. They can now get on the server and chase down the error logs and what have you. They can integrate applications as they need and broaden that breadth and depth of their ecosystem. And then when I see a customer moving to from a private cloud into a SaaS again, it's very similar again from a on-premise move. Those restrictions bring themselves in, and you need to be figuring out, some workarounds for that.
I would say the only other piece that I would add here, Brad, as well is functionally you can do a shift as well. Depending on versions of ERPs, a lot of ERPs are the backend might have a structure of terminal servers or RDS farms on the backend. And when you move to a web application, even in the private cloud, that will shift costs, licensing, depending on if you're moving from that model to now we're going to use like a web UI or a web application, can drastically change costs, and it is something to consider as well.
That's a good point. As they say, shift happens. Yeah, understanding terminal server licensing, both at the operating system and the client level. Nice thing there that potentially, as applications move away from what they call desktop applications that are very terminal server based, like super fat clients, yeah, that can definitely give you some benefits in cost. And so when I talk with customers and we start that process of discovery, we go kind of through a checklist with as we suss out the hybrid cloud configuration. We ask several questions. And one important question is understanding what's your level. And that's actually two questions bundled into one, because you think about third-party applications, they communicate at different levels, right? At your top level, you have your API. That's kind of like the web API layer where you're using the internet and like a TCP/IP protocol, probably using like REST seems to be the latest fad to speak to an application. So that's the top level where your most contemporary applications are using. At level lower, you have the application layer. And that's not uncommon that you have applications or integrations that install in the application server and invoke those business object methods directly to automate certain activities inside of your ERP system. That's still, I think, a very common way of doing that. At the next level, you might have something that's server-based. So it's doing some kind of server-based integration and operating using, potentially like command line execution or scheduled task execution to run certain tasks that are kind of moving around at that level. And at the lowest level, and I see this a lot with some legacy applications, desktop applications tend to, I think, drop a lot in the database layer because they don't have, the application layer, the server layer to perform those integrations. They have to be writing directly to the database. You end up with a database that is your pristine ERP database with a whole bunch now of stored procedures and schedules, like SQL schedules doing their own thing on. So you get to this weird situation where your database really isn't yours anymore. It's kind of a blend. And that can get dicey. So you really need to understand what each of those things are doing so that you don't end up with one of those spaghetti messes that we had talked earlier. Now, so that's kind of one level. Now, another is how are these things triggered? So those integrations themselves, they might be triggered at different levels. You might have something that's on a schedule, right? So this could be a SQL schedule, a Windows service, a Windows scheduler. You have many ERP systems themselves allow you to have a scheduled task that goes off and fires off a third-party application. So you can invoke a third-party application from within the confines of your own ERP system. That could be a challenge, at least something you definitely want to catch as you're working. You might have something where you have a user invoked integration, right? So you add a button to a field where the user is able now to push that button and trigger an interface. Those become migration challenges, to be sure. And then a final one would be a business logic or infrastructural integration. These are something that lie kind of right below the system, right at that system. Everything's just happening. You're not actually seeing it. The business object methods themselves are most often triggering those integrations. Now, understanding that, how is it invoked? And how does it connect? Really important for you as you kind of move on to that journey and start documenting and understanding how you're going to migrate all these different integrations. So that said, let me talk through a couple of examples here real quick of successful private cloud connections. And let's talk about kind of how you moved from one to another. So I had one where you had some custom ingrown ERP functionality. The developer was gone and it was triggered by an in-application customization, had a DLL, but it was connecting through SQL and the connection string was hard-coded. So now you migrate that into a new environment. Suddenly that hard-coded connection string in the DLL was broken. Fortunately, they had source code, so we found our technicians often find themselves being ad hoc programmers as needed. We had to go open up that in Visual Studio, change that source code to point to the new database, recompile it, redeploy it, change that application customization now to reference its new location because now it was living in a different area. So you find yourselves when you're making those migrations, you might find yourself having to fix those things. Now, ideally, applications are designed in such a way that you have a config file that doesn't require you going in there. So it just references that config file. Unfortunately, a lot of homegrown applications bypass that because they don't think beyond the immediate in server environment they're living in. Here's another one we talk about. This was a local install for reporting integration. It was IIS based with Crystal Reports. Now, Crystal Reports had that same problem. They were all hard coded against a given database. So install the application. That was easy enough. We had to pull up each individual Crystal report and change those connection strings to reference that new database and then deploy the application to IIS. After that, pretty much ran on its own. Sometimes you get a simpler solution like a taxation solution that's communicating through the internal server using the application's own configuration. In this case, it was really easy because it was an outbound ping where it was, making an outbound request to the application and pulling back information for taxation. So all you needed to do here was whitelist that outbound request to make sure that it could get out there successfully. That's ideally some of the easier integrations you get when they're in application integrations, and all you need to do is make sure that the data can get in and out safely. Not as big of a problem. We had another reporting solution. This was actually the same customer. The customer had one reporting solution that was an on-premise connecting to the database, and we had one that was a SaaS solution that connected over the public cloud. The resolution there was we kind of had to do two things. On the application side, we had to configure the outside application so that it came in and made different requests. And on the server side, we had to, to open that appropriate port and whitelist that specific IP so that it was coming in. So you also have this question with security. How are you locking in and securing those applications, making sure that you're not punching so many holes in your firewall that it can't keep anything out? Couple other there. See that arm wrestle there. It always makes me think of that great movie Predator. Yeah, I always feel like the SaaS gods are trying to hunt me in the jungle. So we have one here was an AR automation solution. It was the AR solution was off premise. It received a big dump of information from the application. So you had the SQL server had schedules that it was using, and it had stored procs that it was using. The resolution here, tweak those a little bit, and again, whitelist that outbound push. And really, a lot of these cases, the biggest challenge is not in the fix, it's in the find, right? We find, when I was talking with one of our techs about some of these cases, that's what we said is that 10% or 90% of your time is spent finding, understanding the solutions at hand. The 10% ends up being actually going and making the necessary changes to try to get them to work. I had another one here that was a credit card solution, right? It was a stored procedure with an application. So this case ended up being you deploy it to the server, you had to modify its config file to point to the appropriate areas, and you had to set up the Windows scheduled task. to run the application on a schedule. So you start to see here, each of these ways that these things are being triggered or run might be a little different, might be a service, might be a scheduled task. One last one here. This was an interesting one because it was one where we had a good vendor involvement. So it was an on-prem install with a Windows service was the basic architecture. Our resolution really was just reach out to the vendor, get them involved, give them the access they needed to help install, configure the application, get the Windows service up and running, verify. And after that, it was just a matter of taking one of our Watcher programs and putting the Watcher program on that service to make sure that it continued to run correctly. We'll get to this here shortly, is when you're going through a cloud migration. I have a little checklist here. You don't have to read that. It's not meant as an eye chart. It's just an example of when we go through an integration review with the customer. We go through all these different types of integrations, do the Q&A, put the customer in the hot seat, say, okay, do you have this? Do you do credit card processing? Do you have any field service modules? Do you have CAD integrations or any kind of EDI or taxation, what have you? We work through those, and then we'll get customers that when they come to us and say, I only have 2 integrations. Great, okay, and we ask them through the questions, we go down and we review it, and holy cow, we have 16 integrations. We didn't realize that for those reasons that we had mentioned earlier. And really, because you see how all the different places where this exists, sometimes discovery needs to go deep. You find yourself, you have to look at the application, the base ERP applications configuration. You look for rogue SQL schedules and stored procedures. You look for things that are sitting in Windows Scheduler or Windows Services. Good idea to open up IIS and look for app pools that might be non-standard. Sometimes it means you have to do a folder review because who knows sometimes where these applications are reaching out for their code, their source code. It could be in a non-standard location. You can stick a DLL almost anywhere and get it to run. So all that said, as I say, a couple of quick recommendations. So if you're approaching a cloud migration and you want to make this work well so that it takes as minimal time as possible and it goes as quickly as possible and the budget is under control, a couple of quick recommendations here as we wrap up. One would be a discovery, as we've talked about. Get early in the process, get under the hood, vendors, your software vendors, both your core system and your other ancillary systems. They're your friends. Their goal is to try to keep you up and running. So use that and use them to be successful, because they have a wealth of knowledge that will shorten your timeline. If you have developers, get them involved. Sometimes a cloud migration might irk your IT team. They might feel like this is something they're losing as a function. That get them re-engaged and get them helping make this successful. Because if you have a developer who made this solution, it'll be so much faster to make that shift. Find your source code, your installation files, wherever you need those, find those early. Find them often, make sure you know where they are so you don't have to do a lot of hunting and pecking or try to re-image the existing image into the new. You don't have to mess around with that. And then for each connection, make sure you identify some of those key pieces. Is it homegrown? Do you have the source code? What level does it use to connect? Does it use config files, or is it hard coded to get its connections? And what connections does it use? Does it need an IP or a SQL name, a server name? And will those be changing as a function of this migration? Identifying those things that change will help you speed up the fix process. And then how is it triggered? Is it scheduled? Is it on demand? Is it under the covers? Where is this thing happening to make sure that you can actually bring the application over and successfully get it running so that you can verify that? Some more global concerns, I guess I would say, is security. Quite often a migration will surface some security questionable procedures that you've had in the past. Be ready for those and be ready to make some decisions. How do we lock down this application that used to have free reign? Performance concerns. Not all things should be moving into the cloud. I know with one third party, specifically shipping integrations, there's a lot of very timely information that needs to happen very quickly so that shipping labels can get printed out with the proper shipping cost as well. And so to do that, a lot of companies will have an on-premise little database located on their facility site and not in the cloud, so that it can be doing that talking quickly. Now it can get back and forth between the ERP system as needed, but that single little lookup that it needs can happen locally. Quite often we see that being something you do to avoid performance concerns. And then version issues. Now, if you're working especially with old code that was compiled against a certain format, you might find yourself having to recompile that. Or if you're working with a vendor system that now, okay, I'm moving to a new version of Windows. Will that old system still work, or do we need to do some work there? So again, that vendor communication becomes a really important. So Chris, from your discoveries that you've done with other customers, any good additional recommendations you would have at that onset as you start to kind of pull up the covers and see what's underneath?
One of my recommendations is I think that implementations, it's always best to give yourself headroom. And so what I recommend to all customers is if people are really looking at going cloud or looking at vetting that, whether it's private, public, hybrid, doesn't really matter, is give yourself that extra leeway. So if your drop deadline is, let's say start of Q4, you want to be right at the beginning of Q4, you want to be implemented, you want to be off on-prem. Give yourself enough room during that discovery phase for third-party integration, security concerns, costs. Do a little bit of that homework up front and start that conversation early, and it will make for better implementations when you go live. I think sometimes people try to cram a little bit too much, and people wear multiple hats at jobs. People have multiple projects going on at the same time. This is not one of those projects that you want to try to take a 90-day window and squeeze it in 30 days. Can it be done? Sure. It just becomes more painful than it has to be. And so that's my biggest recommendation, is give yourself that extra leeway. So if you want to do into Q4 implementation, start having those conversations, start the discovery, the quoting process, getting through those moving parts in Q3 versus waiting till Q4 to try to make that happen.
Very good. And that being said, this concludes our webinar for today. Chris and I will hang around here for a minute if there are any other questions. I would say if I'm looking back at this, I think one of the biggest keys is, as you start to kind of move to a more cloud-based model of applications, you start thinking now for the next solution. I have a customer right now, they're needing to integrate with outside systems optimization. This is kind of a shop floor optimization solutions. You start to think about now, what does this new integration need to look like? What do I want to do in terms of its integration level? What's the most scalable, right? Because I think when we talk about scalable solutions, we run into problems because older solutions may not have been built with the same scalability concerns, like the hard coding of IP addresses or SQL connections. That's probably the most common. I think that's probably an area where, whenever you're doing application development, you want to be thinking about how is the best way to make this thing scalable? Because I think scalability and the cloud are one of those big pieces there. So as we wrap up, any concluding thoughts before we let the audience back to the rest of their weekend?
Like you said, make sure you give yourself enough time. With the right partner, I think doing cloud migrations can actually be a pretty enjoyable and streamlined business process. Just make sure that you pick who you get into bed with closely when you're looking at projects that really are going to affect your organization at this level.
Oh, that's good advice. And yeah, so if you are out there and considering a move of your ERP system to the cloud, you're more than welcome to reach out to Chris or myself and have a further conversation with that. And at that, we will release you for the day. You have yourself a very fine weekend, and we look forward to talking to you some more. Thanks a lot.